Hello and welcome back to the AP US History Curriculum for Era 8. In this video, we will be looking at Topic 8.11, the expansion of the Civil Rights Movement to include other groups in the 1960s and 1970s. So let's get to it. In the early 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement was in full swing. Students sat at lunch counters, marchers walked across bridges, Dr. King spoke of dreams, and all across America, other groups were watching. They too began to mobilize and demand change. Among them were students, women, Latinos, Native Americans, and those who were gay. During and after World War II, the Bracero program had brought millions of Mexican citizens to the U.S. to work in the agricultural and railroad industries, which were experiencing labor shortages due to the war. While they were promised minimum wages, decent housing, and transportation, many workers faced discrimination, substandard conditions, and wage theft. Through organized efforts, they successfully challenged some of the discrimination, getting the segregation of Mexican students in California schools declared illegal, in the case of Mendez v. Westminster in 1947. But the discrimination continued. In the 1950s, the federal government launched Operation Wetback, deporting thousands of Mexican immigrants, many without due process. For those that remained, poverty was an ongoing problem. In the 1960s, Cesar Chavez helped form the United Farm Workers. Farm workers were some of the poorest laborers in America, and they went on strike and called for a nationwide boycott of grapes to fight against the exploitation of farm workers. This growing Chicano movement took inspiration from the Black Power and civil rights activism to demand better schools, political representation, and cultural pride. Still another group demanding the restoration of rights were Native Americans. To understand their plight, we have to go back to the 19th century. The Dawes Act in 1887 had broken up tribal landholdings and forced assimilation. Many Native children were taken from their families and raised in boarding schools that sought to kill the Indian to save the man, as the founder of the Carlisle Indian School put it. These schools often subjected students to harsh discipline, cultural suppression, and abuse, causing long-lasting trauma to Native American families and communities. This policy was reversed in the 1930s with the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. But in the 1950s, the federal government changed policies again, beginning what was called the Indian Termination Policy, whereby the U.S. government withdrew its recognition and protection of dozens of tribal groups. This weakened reservations, often leaving tribal members with no choice but to relocate to cities. By the 1960s, many of these tribal groups began organizing, following the example of the Civil Rights Movement. In 1969, members of the American Indian Movement, or AIM, occupied Alcatraz Island, which had closed as a federal prison and was declared surplus property, which, according to the Treaty of Fort Laramie from 1868, all retired, abandoned, or out-of-use federal land was to be returned to the indigenous people who once occupied it. AIM occupied the island for 19 months before being driven out. In 1972, they occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs headquarters, arriving in a caravan they called the Trail of Broken Treaties. In 1973, AIM members were invited to come to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, and while there led an armed occupation of Wounded Knee, the site of the 1890 massacre. Several people were killed in confrontations with law enforcement. At the time, there was widespread public sympathy for the goals of the occupation, as Americans were becoming more aware of long-standing issues of injustice related to Native peoples. Congress responded with the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act in 1975, which restored tribal sovereignty and invested in educational improvements with the tribes themselves, determining what was best. Meanwhile, Japanese Americans were also seeking justice. During World War II, they had lost homes, businesses, and land. They had been forced into internment camps, and excluded from whole regions of the U.S. In 1944, the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled that the exclusion orders affecting Japanese Americans were constitutional in the case of Korematsu v. U.S. In the post-war years, they began what is known as the redress movement to gain an official apology and reparations for the injustice that had been inflicted upon them. President Ford would eventually issue an official apology in 1976. During the Carter administration, Congress created a commission to study the idea of reparations and eventually recommended $20,000 be paid to each detainee, though it was not actually carried out until the 1990s. Since the 19th century, women had sought equality. Remember Seneca Falls back in 1848 and the 19th Amendment in 1920? And women flocking to work during the World Wars? But in the 1950s, women had been pressured to return to traditional roles of homemakers, focusing on children and family. But in the early 1960s, Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique. She argued that society had trapped women in domestic roles, denying them opportunity and identity. While many had thought that women had wanted to confine themselves to domestic pursuits, Friedan's research suggested otherwise and pointed out challenges faced by American women, such as significant inequality in earnings, with women earning just 39 cents for every dollar that a man did doing the same work. The so-called glass ceiling. There wasn't one Fortune 500 company that even had a single female executive. That women could be denied employment if they had children, that women sometimes had to give up control of finances, assets, and even medical decisions to their husbands. Just to give you an example, the wife of the governor of Alabama was diagnosed with cancer in 1961, but the doctor didn't tell her. He told her husband, and he didn't even tell his wife. So she got no care for it until 1965, when she began to notice more significant symptoms and finally learned of her disease. This feminist movement led to the establishment of the National Organization for Women, which sought equal opportunity and equal pay. Their efforts did result in change, including Title IX of the Educational Amendments in 1972, which banned discrimination based on gender in education. One of the most visible areas of Title IX in action is the funding of women's sports teams at both high schools and colleges. Laws were also changed to make it easier for women to initiate a divorce. They were able to get credit in their own names. They could make major purchases without a man's approval. The introduction of the birth control pill in 1960 also gave women control over reproduction. One of the biggest victories of this women's rights movement was the Supreme Court decision of Roe v. Wade. The court ruled 7-2 that a right to privacy under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment extended to a woman's decision to have an abortion, disallowing many state and federal restrictions on abortion. Although it was modified slightly in 1992's Planned Parenthood v. Casey, it would be overturned completely in 2022 in the case of Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, allowing states to reintroduce restrictions on access to abortion. Another significant result of the women's rights movement was the creation of the Equal Rights Amendment, an idea that had been first introduced and debated back in the 1920s. Though it didn't pass Congress until early 1972, when it was sent to the states for ratification. While it did garner support, it failed ratification by the necessary 38 states. Conservative activist Phyllis Schlafly led a campaign against it. She argued it would destroy traditional family rules, force women into military combat, and undermine motherhood. While the more radical position of the women's liberation movement had continued, demanding an end to sexism in the media, workplace discrimination, the strengthening of laws against sexual harassment and rape, equal pay, and access to childcare and reproductive freedom, the expansion of rights has sparked resistance because not all Americans believed that social change was progress. Still another group that sought civil rights was made up of people from the LGBTQ community. For much of American history, this group had lived in fear because homosexuality was criminalized in most states. The FBI targeted gay Americans, and many lost jobs in anti-communist purges. But sociologists in the late 1940s and early 1950s suggested that homosexuality was more common than was assumed. With the civil rights movement growing, some LGBT people began to form more visible communities. Some bookstores, cafes, and bars began to welcome openly gay people. Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village in New York was one such place. In June 1969, a police raid, which wasn't an uncommon occurrence, into the crowded bar resulted in a riot. Tensions increased into a second day, sparking protests and demonstrations. The raid on the Stonewall Inn marked a turning point in the movement, with it becoming more visible and more confrontational. Activists demanded the decriminalization of homosexuality, the passage of anti-discrimination laws, and public acceptance. There were some local successes, like the election of Harvey Milk in San Francisco in 1977, though he was assassinated in 1978. But there was also backlash. A coalition of conservatives launched a campaign called Save Our Children to repeal civil rights laws that protected gay citizens. Some states, California included, attempted to pass laws that would force the dismissal of homosexual public school employees. The gay liberation movement and the LGBTQ rights movement continued to grow throughout the 1970s and beyond, remaining quite active into the present day. Students began to organize in 1960 with the founding of Students for a Democratic Society, which became one of the most influential student activist organizations. The SDS was critical of the U.S. political system, and in its Port Huron statement called for a more participatory democracy so that individuals could have more of a say in decisions affecting their lives. SDS focused on a range of issues, including civil rights, poverty, and opposition to the Vietnam War. In 1964, University of California, Berkeley student Mario Savio began what was essentially a free speech movement, protesting against restrictions by the university on political speech and activism on campus. He and other students took over the administration building and staged a sit-in. This protest at Berkeley was the first example of large-scale student protests. The results of this free speech movement were more freedom for college students in selecting their own classes, determining their own schedules, and encouraging political activity. Now remember, at this point in history, the voting age was 21, not 18, like it is now. They also challenged societal norms, particularly around the issue of sexual norms. From 1960 to 1980, the civil rights struggle widened dramatically. Some used the courts, some used boycotts and protests, and many Americans resisted these changes. The period was not just about expanding rights, it was about redefining what equality meant in America. Well, that about covers what you need to know about topic 8.11, the expansion of the civil rights movement. Be sure to keep up with your reading, and I'll catch you in the next video.